Everyone, and thank you for joining us for our last and closing lecture for this semester. My name is Ursula Kripa. For the students in Lubbock who don't know me, I teach in the El Paso campus, and today I'll be introducing Kathryn. Our dean, Jim Williamson, apologizes. He's been having all sorts of software and technical difficulties all day, and so he is doing his best to join us. So I will introduce Kathryn, and then Kathryn will share her screen, and we'll start. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Kathryn Dean tonight. And I'll read a little bit about her bio, and then we'll go into the talk. In 1991, Kathryn Dean formed Dean Wolfe Architects and achieved immediate recognition for her designs of the Spiral House and Urban Interface Loft. Her projects are distinguished by a thought-provoking manipulation of light and space. The firm's award-winning loft interiors have been described as, quote, small-scale wonders precisely crafted from sensuous materials, end quote. Kathryn's award-winning practice is consistently published internationally in publications such as Architectural Record, Architectural Review, and GA, and has garnered numerous design excellence recognitions. Most recently, the Queen's Hospital Emergency Medical Station 50 was nominated for the prestigious Mies Crown Hall America's Prize, and Ephemeral Edge House won a New York City AIA Honor Award and will be published in Architect in February and The Plan in May. I don't know if these months are old. It might already be published. Kathryn has been an architect, scholar, and educator since the inception of her career. So she has done all these three simultaneously. She was awarded the Rome Prize in Architecture from the American Academy in Rome in 1987 and has received a Young Architects Award from Progressive Architecture in 93 and the Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York in 97. Author of Constructive Practices Between Economy and Desire, published by Columbia University in 2008, and the 2011 Princeton Architectural Press monograph of Dean Wolfe Architects titled Constructive Continuum, Kathryn is committed to the cross-pollination that comes through combining teaching and professional practice. Kathryn began teaching in 91 as an adjunct professor at Columbia University. In 98, she was a visiting assistant professor at Harvard University, and in 2000, she returned to Columbia as an assistant professor, where she taught both me and Stephen Miller. She also has taught as a distinguished visiting professor at University of Michigan, University of Virginia, and University of Florida. From 2008 to 2019, Kathryn served as the director of the Graduate School of Architecture and as a Joanne Stolarov-Kotzen professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Kathryn's built work is powerful, is materially honest, and structurally intelligent. Her teaching is generous and empowering. She teaches her students both how to design with instinct while also grounding their work in constructability and material constraints. She's been I need to say this is a personal note, but Kathryn has been a generous and strong mentor for women, including me in many ways. Somehow, while running her own really busy practice in New York City, directing a graduate program at WashU in St. Louis, and raising two amazing daughters, she always made time to mentor and support young women and to support me through life, fellowship applications, practice opportunities, and teaching. So when women empower, support other women, we have a better world. And so tonight, I'm super thrilled that Kathryn will be sharing her work with us. And so you can start sharing your screen.
Thank you, Ursula. That was a really beautiful introduction. I especially appreciate the part about being a female mentor since I had none. The lecture tonight is called Program, People, and State of Mind. Program, as it is conventionally understood, defines the use of a building. It is a set of square footage requirements and adjacencies that meets the basic needs of the people, of governments, institutions, businesses, communities, families. It implies an efficient functioning whole made up of the component parts, but lacks the most important part of what makes us human, our desires. Program, at its highest aspiration, fulfills our deep humanity. It helps us to understand our culture, our time frame, our intellect, our emotion, our dreams, and our fears. Program at this highest aspiration can be understood as the realm of art. How does art create a state of mind? How does a state of mind create emotional and intellectual experience? Program, people, state of mind, or what I learned from amazing artists at the American Academy in Rome. What I learned from the American Academy in Rome was something quite different from what I learned from architecture school. From architecture school, I learned about everything external about architecture. I learned about what organizes plans, what creates beautiful sections, how do you create structure and make it whole. I learned everything about what makes it something in an external world, but I felt there was something missing that was what made architecture great, and I couldn't figure out what that was. And what I learned from the American Academy in Rome was how to make it something internal rather than only external. And what the artists that I met talked about was how to make it something how to make work from the self. And at first I had not the slightest idea what that meant. But then you need to understand about the self is what their backgrounds are. So the first artist I met is Bruce Nauman. He was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He studied mathematics and physics in Wisconsin. He moved to UC Davis to study art during the Vietnam War, became a part of Leo Castelli's stable of artists, and lives in New Mexico with his wife, Susan Rothenberg. This piece called Raw War, what's important to understand, what you're seeing, war on the screen, is the second image. The first image is the reverse. It's RAW. So it flashes raw war, in response to the issue of his generation, the Vietnam War. In a very direct manner, he confronts the issues of life in a fascination with language, puns, and double meanings in a circular structure of moving light. Love, hate, pleasure, pain, life, death, in a commentary on Freudian and human conditions. The double video corridor compresses your body to confront your mind while your eyes confront the video monitor in front of you. On the top, you watch yourself walking away, frustrating your desire for self-perception, and watching yourself disappearing, which confronts your own mortality. And on the bottom, there's nothing, as if you were never there. Martin Puryear is an African-American artist, and that's important to understand. He was the second artist I met at the American Academy. He was born in Washington, D.C., spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in Sierra Leone in Africa, teaching English, French, biology, and art. He used the opportunity to study with local craftsmen. He lived in Brooklyn while teaching in Maryland before moving to Chicago. He now lives in the Hudson Valley in a house that he built for himself. This piece, called Self, is Black, alone, mute, but at the same time strong and a powerful presence in the space. Sanctum deals more directly with psychological and sexual information through simultaneous allusions to voluptuousness, Blackness, and sanctuary. A ladder for Booker T. Washington can only be understood if you know that Booker T. Washington was born into slavery, and yet he was the first African-American man ever to visit the White House when Teddy Roosevelt was president. A quote from Booker T. Washington: "Success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which he has overcome." So Eva Hess obviously was not at the American Academy, but there were no female artists at the American Academy. In reference earlier to I never had any female mentors. So I had to have a woman artist because I was very influenced by female artists. And so I picked my favorite. She was born into a Jewish family in Hamburg, Germany, just before World War II, making her a double outsider. She was both female and Jewish. She emigrated to New York City, married and returned to Germany for her husband's career, then later returned on her own to New York and began experimenting with latex and fiberglass. She died at the age of 36 due to a brain tumor. This first piece is called Ishtar. It was inspired by the Ishtar Gates in Berlin. What's important to see, I hope you can see it, is the back surface is a series of domes that resemble the shapes of breasts all across the surface at the back, multiplied many, many, many times. What's different between this and the Ishtar Gates are all the strings that come out of it. They're like the Medusa hairs, that kind of wild femaleness that she's engaging. This piece, called Continuum, was made just before she died. It's a set of skin-like ethereal sheets that dip down from the ceiling, touching momentarily to the floor. It was created in these last few months of her brief, one might say, contingent life. 7 Poles was not completed until after she died. It was completed by her lover, who worked with her at the end of her life. What's interesting about the piece is that the poles are L-shaped and the ends of the L's pull inward toward each other as if they're dependent upon each other, which she was at that time in her life. For these artists, the connection between form and material creates the content of the work, which is deeply arresting. Form and content. This is an architectural idea, and one might even say that some of their work is site-specific, like architecture. But what is unique to architecture is that the psychological content, the state of mind, does not come from the self. It comes from the user. This first project is called Expansive Eruption, Spiral House. It's the first major commission that I had, and it's the first thing that I ever did that I thought was good. What was important was I had no idea of my theory at this time. It was just happened because of my state of mind at the moment and who the client was. The client was a very ambitious man, and I had just left Cohn Pedersen Fox, and when I left, I went into Gene Cohn and told him that he had a problem working with women. And he said, "Oh, you mean Bill Pedersen?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, we don't make Bill work with women because he doesn't like working with women." And I said, "You know, that's illegal." He immediately called a meeting the next day after I left, and they had an affirmative action program in the office, which I was quite happy about. But at the same time, I was really angry that someone could even feel that way. And so I went into this project with a lot of that anger within me. And what happened was that my anger combined with this client's like rather aggressive ambition created a rather aggressive house. This is the first image that I'm going to show you. It grows out of 2 desires from the house. The house had one desire, which was from its site, which was a rock outcropping. And that desire was to create a spiral like this that expanded outward from the top of the rock into the forest. And then there was another secondary impulse, which was to go like this and reach up into the sky. So you can see the lower part is that reaching out into the forest and then up into the sky. This is the house. The original site came out of the outcropping on the far left. It was a big domed rock, and I didn't want to sit on top of the rock and dominate the rock. So what we convinced the client to do was to dynamite the site so that the house and the rock would sit in partnership with each other. And then you can see how the house is spiraling up from around the backside of the rock and around it and releasing. And then the top part of it is cantilevering out into the forest. This is the culmination of that upward spiral and the top part of it going out into the forest. And again, you can see the partnership with the rock. Here you see the foundations of the house, which are concrete, clad in rock in the image behind, and the other portion of the house, which is wood frame, is clad in cedar, so that you knit together the wood frame and the foundation and express it materially in the exterior wall of the house. The interior, because of reverse force perspective and the way it works opening out, pushes you out into the forest through the double-story window wall as you enter the house. And at the same time, the skylights, which penetrate up through the second floor, bring clear skylight, clear blue light into the middle of the house, which counters the hot yellow light in the summer or in the winter time, and the green light that comes in through the forest in the summertime. Here you see the lower part of the rock, which was dynamited out, and how the house nestles in between the upper part of the house, or the upper part of the rock and the lower part of the house, and occupies that plateau in between. Fluid Fields, Operable Boundary Townhouse Garden, is one of my favorite clients ever. They're both psychoanalysts, so they're very aware. When I first met them, she wanted badly to renovate her kitchen and to get a better connection to the garden. And he didn't really like spending money very much. So he was trying to convince her that they didn't really need to do that. And he said, you know, I feel like I'm really coming home to my own little French restaurant every night. And she said, you know, I feel like I'm a servant in your French restaurant. I said, well, that's interesting, because you're actually occupying the servants' quarters of a 19th century townhouse. And that garden out there, the reason there's not any connection to it is because it used to be a vegetable garden. So the first thing we did was to try to create a stronger connection between the inside of the house and the outside of the house. In doing that, we decided to excavate the whole ground floor, which took out all of the servant spaces between, and get rid of the servant stair and create an open stair which linked the lower floor to the upper floor and brought a whole lot of light between the back garden and the front part of the house. And at the same time, excavate out the butler's pantry from the second floor at the top of the stair. And that allowed us to take the 7'10" floor, or 7'10" ceiling height, which was really oppressive, and give it this really high space over the dining room table, which made the whole ground floor feel very, very open. At the top of the floor, or at the top of the steps, the concrete floor continues and meets the wood floor. And at the same time, it, for the first time ever, connected the lower level into the upper public levels of the house. So the house felt like one continuous house finally. At the threshold between the new construction and the old construction, we inserted a piece of glass, which served as a kind of threshold between new and old, and also admitted light from above to below. Looking down at the table from above, you can see the secondary idea of the house, which was to create transparency between the inside and the outside garden space by pivoting open a 13-foot high window, the frame of that window, over a long table that linked inside to outside. She was a cook, she loved to entertain, and so she had a 20-foot long table that she could have huge garden parties when she decided that she wanted to entertain. Well, the disappearing window and the disappearing door left two silicone glazed frames, so it's almost transparent between inside and out. And rather than having a single column at the end of the beam, which would have blocked it as an object, we used two C channels, which are split, so it became another kind of frame that was open between interior and exterior. At the same time, it was important that in the other direction, you feel a sense of weight, because the brick wall overhead was 1 foot wide. So the frame is very thin in one dimension and very deep in the other dimension. The doors and the window are cantilevered off the back wall, so they're completely free of the wall itself and are part of the garden. Here you see, with the door and window open, the complete transparency from the garden to the interior and the way the space is joined. And at the same time, you see the silicone glazing of the window above and the window below, and how transparent the house is when the window and the door are open. Dynamic Descent Implied Rotation Townhouse was a house for a woman who had lost her husband, her husband was quite a good architect. And I knew him and I knew her. And I was a little bit nervous about doing the house because we were quite different architects than her husband. And I told her that. And she said, actually, I want something more feminine. And for some reason, when she's told me that, an image of Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase popped into my head. And when that popped into my head, I thought about it, and I thought about what a townhouse stair is. And I realized that a townhouse stair normally is a stair for the man coming home, and it is grounded to the parlor floor. So it's meant to greet the man coming home to the parlor floor and take him up into the private spaces. And I thought, this is a house for a woman. And it's a woman who has 2 children, and she wants the ground floor to be centered on the kitchen. So this stair is going to be different. This stair is going to be hung from the ceiling and from her bedroom and descend down to the kitchen. So it doesn't celebrate coming home to the house at night. It celebrates waking up and starting your day with your family, and then going to work. This is an image of a screen that's between the master bedroom at the top of the house. It's an animated screen, and it captures also the sense of the nude descending the staircase. And here you see that screen looking up and the skylight that brings house all the way down into the house below, where we excavated out a 2-story space. So this small skylight actually brings light into the entire volume of the space. Because light is oftentimes the only relationship to nature in the city, and because this particular townhouse didn't have a real public or real private backyard space. The backyard space was part of the public realm. It seemed important to capture an interior volume which brought nature into the space. This is looking along that same screen from the dressing area to the door of the bedroom, and from the stair looking back to the dressing area. Now you're in the public space. This is the way light moves across that screen over the course of the day. And the stair, which is designed using a 4-inch rule, which is the maximum amount of space that you can have in a guardrail, and playing with that and using it to manipulate your perception of movement with a folded stainless steel laser cut and suspended stair. Stephen Mueller, who you guys know as a professor, is actually the project architect on this project. The stair, as it comes to the ground floor, opens out into the kitchen, which is the center of the house. And here you can see, looking back up at the stair, the 2-story volume overhead and the light as it comes into that space. To give you a sense of what the light is like over the course of time, I did this video. Restless Response, Queens Emergency Medical Service Station 50 is a commission that I received shortly after the 9/11 disaster in New York City. And it's important to understand that I live 8 blocks from the World Trade Center. Why that's important is because the Emergency Medical Service Station is a part of the Fire Department of New York, and both the EMS and the fire department were very important in my neighborhood during that time. So I started the project, did several schemes, kind of liked them. Nothing really felt quite right. And finally I came up with the idea of 2 horizontal bars And I couldn't really figure out why I felt like it was right. And then I remembered 9/11, and I realized the resonance between two horizontal bars and the two towers. What was really amazing is that when I went to photograph the site, which was at 5:30 in the morning one morning, I was the first one there, the station captain came to me and he brought me into the elevator and he had me look up at the ceiling and he said, "Is this project about 9/11? And I was kind of shocked because he knew it was about 9/11. So this pattern, which becomes a pattern in the concrete and a pattern in the ceiling, was initially inspired by a flash of tail lights moving against, or vanishing into the night, which are the tail lights of the emergency medical services vehicles leaving. This is the building. The horizontal bars were later adjusted to the site, which doesn't seem in this image to be so strongly sloping downward, but the site has a really strong slope to the street. And initially it felt like a really sad location because the site was dropping off in one direction from back to front and the other direction along the street. So I called it a site of negative entropy. And when we started to play with adjusting the bars, we used the slope of the street to create something that would rise up out of the site and turn back. So it went chunk, chunk. And so it countered the negative energy with a very powerful upward energy. And we felt that that gave it a much more powerful dynamic energy that seemed much more like the restlessness of the state of mind of emergency medical services workers who are always on call and always ready for the next thing that may be happening. The other thing that was important about the way it was developed on the site is that it was able to stretch all the way across the site, which created kind of a dam between the very large hospital building, which is behind it, and some very tiny little two-story houses that you can't see in the foreground. So the idea of the building was that it be long in plan and small in section, which would allow it to create a relationship with both the large hospital behind it and the houses in the front. At the point of the hinge is the apparatus floor, which is the garage. It's the place where most of the activity of the building happens. It's the place where all the ambulances are and where people are servicing the ambulances and where they're ready for action. That is the kind of central space of the building. It's also kind of a big room, a public room on the street. And you can see now the small houses across the street with their sloping roofs and sloping porches, and see how the two sloping roofs of the bars kind of mimic that relationship. The interior uses the identity of FDNY, or of FDNY EMS, which is the identity of the ambulances, the red, the white, the stainless steel, the kind of crispness of all those things as the identity for what the materials can be on the interior space. This joint between the apparatus floor and the public entries, called the station office, it basically commands the entire building. As you move upstairs, you're moving upstairs because there's an underground utility tunnel that we also had to deal with. So this utility tunnel was existing previously, and we had to get over the top of it. And we also had to find a way not to put any pressure on the utility tunnel. So what we did was to create two buttresses and to span across those two buttresses with two 180-foot long trusses. So you're seeing one truss and where it's sitting on the top of the elevator core, and the other truss is outside resting on that other concrete plane, and the other two supports are behind us. This stair takes you up to the second floor, where the space is divided between a lounge for the station office and a district office, as the building is also the district headquarters for all of Queens. That truss zone is the identity of the district offices. And it is what is the structure of the other building. Here you see in the foreground where it's being supported as well. And you also see some of the patterning of the concrete in the foreground. At the joint between those is a two-story space. It looks back down into the lobby, and it's adjacent to the lounge for the station office, which is overlooking the apparatus floor. The building, with its ever-ready presence at night, looking down the street, and looking again at nighttime, you can see the two planes of concrete with the 180-foot-long truss that's supporting it. You can see the patterned fritted glass that's stretching across the front of it. And in the far background, you can see how far away it is from Manhattan. It's an hour and a half by public transportation to get there. And the building at nighttime serves as a beacon of safety and a place of support for the community. It's a 24-hour condition. It's always like this. It's a place of safety and security for everyone. And it's a place that represents the really proud people of the emergency medical services that serve our city. Sculpted Skyline Garden Light Loft was just recently finished. It's a space that's the top floor of a building that at the moment had no relationship to the roof. So the idea was to insert a concrete structure to allow a roof garden to be built on top of it, and to create connections between the sky, the skyline, and the garden itself. In order to create that concrete structure, we decided that we wanted to use twisted apertures, which would create ruled surfaces and really sculpt the light between above and below. So this is the formwork that allowed those to happen. Here you get a sense of what those apertures are like. This is the largest of the apertures. It actually connects from the 6th floor to a penthouse structure above that's also made out of concrete. And suspended from that concrete structure above is a steel stair, a stainless steel stair that drops down into the space. The wooden joists are supported on the twisted concrete beam. You can see that the blocking is raised so that the light can pass between the space beyond and the space we're occupying here. And you can also see the difference in material weight between the wooden beams, which are quite heavy, and the very delicate and horizontal, and the very delicate vertical stainless steel lines, which are supported from the concrete above, so that you get a difference between a 19th century technology and a 20th century technology working together. These twisted beams are inspired by a candela structure, which he used in the stadium, but it basically is a twisted ruled surface that allows you to move from completely vertical to a completely horizontal surface. And you can see how it allows light to fully penetrate the space. And there's a second aperture in the space beyond, leading to the public corridors, and the third one, which you can't see, in the kitchen. Here you see the space, or the aperture that's in the kitchen, the one that leads to the bedroom beyond, and you see the difference between the sculpted concrete and the very flat aluminum, and the very flat aluminum, which is split to create a plexiglass lens, allowing the same passage of light through the doors in the private spaces. This is the master bedroom at the end of that corridor, connected to the master bathroom, and the other two sculpted doors are the two girls' bedrooms. When you leave the master bathroom, you have the same ruled surface concrete framing a connection to the skyline, which is the Herzog and Demeron building, which I've always very admired in Tribeca. That sets you up to ascend the stairs to the rooftop and to the skyline until you reach the terrace and begin to proceed out to the cantilevered concrete and the opening to the terrace. We worked with actually I figured out and got my window manufacturer to manufacture a door that was open in the corner. So we used their typical standard folding door and figured out how to create a door that also opened in the corner, so that the entire corner of the space opened out into the garden. And there was no glass and everything could disappear and it could just be one continuous space. And this is the space as you're looking back on it. You can see the concrete ceiling and it's cast and cantilevered out. And you can also see the concrete structure below in the skylight, the twisted rolled surface of that sculpted form as it brings light into the lower level. The two skylights on the left are in the master bathroom and in the girls' bathroom. So the idea of connecting to this skyline and connecting to the garden and creating a kind of continuous insertion of concrete and stainless steel, which bring a kind of modern insertion of occupation into a 19th century loft building, becomes complete at this level. Ephemeral Edge, the Zeavin country house, is another project for what I told you was my favorite client, the two psychoanalysts. So in this house, they only asked me for two things. They asked me for a sense of solace that they felt in their Brooklyn house, and they wanted another spectacular table. So I thought about a sense of solace and how was a sense of solace different from the city to the country. And I thought about nature and how nature has a very different sense of time and a very different sense of sensuousness. And when we went to the site, I tried to think about how do you capture a sense of light and time and more continuous enjoyment of time over the course of a day. The house is situated in a site that's very important to understand. It's not easy to understand. First of all, it's a sloping site and it has a constructed pond on a sloping site. So in order to create a pond on a sloping site, you have to first carve the first slope and then you have to build up the second slope. So you get an object like this on a slope. You can kind of get a sense of that. If you look to the edge of the pond, you see that the trees are slipping way down behind the edge of that pond. So we're standing in the front where the site has been cut and beyond the site is very much filled. So when we first went to the site, the pond was this very strange object sitting in the middle of a big forest clearing. So that's also important to understand. The trees used to be the middle of a forest. So all the trees at the edges of it are trees that are light starved because they used to be in the middle of a forest. So they have just tall trunks and trees and leaves at the top. So they have this strong legginess that you see in all along the edge of the site. So the first instinct was to try to create something that connected the house to the pond as one constructed continuous whole, to try to link the pond to the house and the house to the site to join everything back together. So first of all, the curve obviously comes from the pond. And then the next thought, which is how do you organize the curve radially? The radial organization of the plan comes from the center of the pond and it organizes 5 planes. The end of the house, the first bar where you see steel coming up, the second, the third steel plane, and the other end of the house. That's important because it will come up later. Then the next thing that comes from this image is what to do about that strange edge of trees and how do you manage that? And finally, we came up with the idea of trying to bring the identity of the trees into the middle of the house. So we decided that we wanted to structure the house with the rebar. And I first told my engineer, he was, so let me get this right. You want to make walls of concrete without the concrete, right? And I said, yes, that's basically it. Then he goes, well, let me think about that. So anyway, he did think about it, and he figured out how to do it. The next important thing about the project is a programmatic idea. So the programmatic idea was that the public spaces would open out in section, like the Spiral House does, to compress your sense out into the landscape. And then the private spaces of the house would close down in section like this, so that you could get a sense of enclosure and interiority and kind of more protection, but a more intimate sense of relationship to the view. So you see that relationship of the public to the private part of the house, and then you see one continuous ruled surface that goes twisting from the public to the private spaces. The other part from this image is that as we came with the idea of the ruled surface kind of being like the continuity of the banks of the pond, maybe we should use the strangeness of these banks, which are, they start out as concave and then merge into something convex, to use a twist in the form of the house. So the house literally twists from one section, which opens up around the house, to another section that closes down. The entry ramp comes from the parking area all along the front of the house and slips into an open space that focuses out on that view beyond. That view beyond, by the way, is the Catskills. Here you can see the entry ramp and the opening out onto the view beyond. And you also see the bedroom end of the house. By the time you get to the end of the house, what started out only on the very edge of the pond has now gotten all the way into the pond. So the last pier of the house, which I call its feet, actually stands in the water. What's nice about that, and which I love playing with, is that it plays with an idea of a psychological term called mirroring, which is a kind of idea of desire and something used in psychoanalysis. So I thought it was appropriate for our clients. And it doubles the house in reflection in the pond. The center of the house, when you come in, is on the dining room table. Remember, she asked me for a special table. The house, if you look carefully, you'll see that the white of the deck beyond becomes a white condition of the floor in the dining room, and the aluminum of the soffit slides in to become an aluminum ceiling on over the dining room. The idea was we were joining the exterior decks to the center of the house, which contained the table, to suggest that it was slipping out to the view beyond and connected to the exterior space. At the same time, pinning it in place are table legs, and table legs that have little cups in them that hold candles. So the candles, which are very ephemeral because they flicker, hold the whole table in place. On the right side of the picture, you see what our engineer finally came up with for the rebar walls. And what he came up with were a set of principles about where we needed to brace. And within those principles, we could decide wherever we wanted to or whatever we wanted to do with the braces themselves. And so what we decided to do was to use the idea of the roof and create a series of ruled surfaces inside of those rebars to create a kind of net. And we were hoping that that net of light with the skylight overhead would create forest light inside of the house. And when you look down the ruled surfaces, this is what you get. On the open side of the rebar in the dining room, which is the only space which actually has the forest exposed, and that's because it's the space that is most closely connected to the exterior, the cross bracing is more random, kind of reflecting the trees. Here you also see again the deck slipping into the flooring and the roofing slipping into the soffit. Now remember when I told you it was important to remember that those planes were radial. Why it was important to remember that is because they're set up on the course of the sun. So the farthest one was the master bedroom bath, and it separates the master bedroom bath and the powder room. The second one is the plane between the kitchen and the dining room. So here you're beginning to see the forest light of the branches of trees coming into the kitchen skylight. And you're seeing that luminous walls start to fill up with light. And so what happens over the course of the day is, first of all, the bathroom one fills with light and then recedes, and then the kitchen one fills with light and then recedes, and then the living room one fills with light and then recedes. So you get this very continuous sense of transformation of time and light over the course of the day. This is the living room one farther on in the course of the day, at the same time looking out over the deck. And this is one of the only conditions where you look out to the exterior, to the front. It's a relationship between the kitchen and the parking lot. And looking at the same time from the bridge all the way through to, if you look really carefully, you can see beyond that hood, the point of the roof through that window. There are two decks, a private deck in the foreground and a public deck in the background. They face south, so they're the warm part of the house, but they have strong overhangs. The private deck has the more deep overhang because it's also facing partially southwest, and the public deck has less of an overhang, so you have two very different conditions environmentally as well. Between the two decks, the railing pushes back to separate them so that the private deck really is private. Here you can see the roof pulling out. And what's really fun is that because the roof rolls down, that point of the roof, when it's raining up, drops rain into the pond. Because the glass curves back and the doors create another plane of glass, another kind of illusory double or mirror is created through the doors themselves when they're closed, creating a kind of another very unreal space that seems to be there but really isn't. At nighttime, the rebar walls work in a very different manner. There's lights located in the far upper corner, so here in the upper left corner, and that light casts shadows across the floor and up sandblasted glass panels that are located all along the front of the building. I hope you can squint and find them because they're very small in this image, but you can see there 3 sandblasted panels with the same rebar patterns cast at night and into the water where it's doubled. This is early evening and later at night. Later at night, you can see that as the lights become more intense, as the night becomes darker, the same thing happens as the light from the deck goes up against the siding on the far right. And because the house is called Ephemeral Edge, and because the desire was to expand the sense of time, I wanted to give you a sense of what the ephemeral aspects of the house were like.
You're muted.
So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so that's my lecture. I wanted to, before I ask if there's any questions, I wanted to also express how happy I am to be part of this lecture series. I think it's really important in this time in the history of our country and the history of everything that's going on, that your school decided to have this particular lecture series. And I think it's really important what young people have started to do in our country at this time. It reminds me very much of the time when I was growing up and what my father told me when I was growing up, and it's been something that I have kept as my life motto, was where there's a will, there's a way. So I faced many setbacks over the course of my life because I was the first woman that I was the first woman that entered architecture school at my university, and there were only 3 women admitted to my class, and there were 57 men in that class. So I never had another woman in my class, and I never had a woman professor. I never had a woman boss. And what is important for all of you to know, that no matter what setbacks you face, always be very, very, very willful, because where there's a will, there's a way. Are there any questions?
Wow, that's great. Thank you, Kathryn. And I think that's really important for our students to hear. We have a Q&A box here. If anyone would like to start typing their questions, I can just start with a few thoughts of my own as a way to start a conversation. What I wanted to talk about was this kind of, I don't know if it's a true or an invented duality, but this this idea that the discipline rests between kind of instinctive design desires and the canon. And so with that in mind, your work, as you also describe it, is deeply both disciplinary in the way it builds on historical precedent. You didn't quite mentioned today, but you also talk about Carlos Scarpa and other architects who have influenced your work. And also it's disciplinary in that way, at looking at history as precedent, but also in the way that it innovates beyond the obvious. And so that there is a rooting in the canon when your work is rooted in canon, but then when it's filtered through your personal design instincts, becomes inventive and invents new approaches to other typologies or kind of materialities and structural solutions. So your instincts are powerful motivations that are somehow anchored in a historical knowledge of various moves that the architectural discipline owns, like the sculpting of light or material honesty or stretching and twisting of geometry, just to like the absolute structural limit. So form and content, as you mentioned, are in your lecture, are very much part of your work. Can you talk a little bit more about where you see the discipline and its pedagogy implementing at times instinct and at times the canon? And what is the value of both for pedagogy and for our students, or maybe this duality is unfounded or it's a false assumption?
It's not a duality. Actually, it's a really interesting question, because what I talked about when I said there was something missing was what was I will also tell you that the architects that I was influenced by were Kahn, Alto, Scarpa, Corbusier, and then more recently Herzog, Demeron, Frank Gehry, Grafton Architects. So, but what I was talking about when I said something was missing was what it was that made those people great. So I think my work is deeply rooted in disciplinary knowledge. And I think disciplinary knowledge is really important, but you can't, if you're only in disciplinary knowledge, you're copying things or mimicking things or taking quotes from. And if you look at corporate work, for the most part, it's taking quotes from. So it's not understanding the relationship between form and content. And so true disciplinary knowledge understands the relationship between form and content, but it also understands that the instinct needs to come from the time and the place and the people. So that's what I said, it's internal or instinctive. It can't be taught. It has to be felt. You can't teach what is the present, and you can't teach what is internal, and you can't teach someone how they observe. I mean, you can teach them how to observe, but you cannot teach them how they observe. What students cannot possibly know, and what hopefully by the time they're maybe 30 begin to know, is how they observe, because it is how they see the world and how they interact with clients, and how what they as a human being can bring as a point of view from their own experiences that can make something original, and nothing else can make anything original. So I think pedagogy needs to teach disciplinary knowledge, absolutely, but not as something to be copied. It is something to be also internalized. So you need to internalize all of the lessons. Oh my God, I drew over. I'll say I was incredibly lucky because I spent 18 months, I had 12 months at the American Academy, and then 6 months traveling. So 6 months of traveling and drawing every single day, every great building in all of Europe, and 2 weeks at the Corbusier Foundation, going through all his notebooks from the Garland Press books, copying his diagrams, teaching how learning how he taught himself composition, like, and that has to be internalized. So you draw and 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 make and make and make and make and make until it's internalized. And I honestly don't, I think reliance on the computer is absolutely critical, but I also think you need to be able to rely on your hand. So the combination of diagramming by hand and drawing over someone's process is really important, and it just becomes internal to you and you don't even realize it. But on the other hand, you have to teach people how to observe, and you can't really teach them that exactly. You can show them how to, maybe. Or I remember with you guys, I created an experiment that allowed you how to find it yourself.
Right.
But that was because it was a deeply personal experiment. And so the only thing you were dealing with was yourself. So it was, I didn't realize it at the time. It grew out of the time frame just after the 9/11 time frame. So it made sense to me. But so, and then obviously the contemporary time frame has so transformed through technology that also has to be deeply a part of what you know. Deeply, deeply a part of what you know. So it's an incredible time to learn to be an architect, I think, because you have to know so many things.
Wow, thank you.
That's a really interesting observation, though, because I hadn't really thought of it that way, because that was internalized so long ago.
Well, I'm glad we can open with that, and I'm hoping students are taking notes, as you have 3 more weeks till final reviews. So it sounds, by my calculations, you have to make 1 million more sketches and internalize all of them. We have questions. If you don't mind, I'll start reading. We have Chris Taylor. Thanks, Kathryn, for sharing such powerful and graceful work. The voice in the space, material, and your energy and wonder are wonderfully inspiring. Love all the details. Can you talk a bit about your interest in following grand and poetic aspirations within granular details?
That's a very interesting question. I think if you add up the granular details, I think it's a very interesting question, and thank you for the compliment. The granular particulars, I learned from Carlos Scarpa. I think I told you this, Ursula. I learned about the absolute particularity of sight from Carlos Scarpa. Everyone thinks you learn details from Carlos Scarpa. That's not what you learn. You learn about the absolute particularity of sight. So when you go, or at least that's what I learned. When you go to Venice and you go to the Querini Stampaglia gallery, or there's all these tiny little mosaics everywhere that reference the quality of light in Venice, which is because it bounces off the canals, just like my house, the light is like this. And all throughout the Querini Stampaglia, it's all like this. And even in that beautiful concrete wall along the back, it's this row of tiny little mosaics that ring it. And the marble in the back, the fountain, is immaculately tiny in scale. It's just unbelievably tiny and precise. And so you get the sense of this absolute delicacy of Venice. And then if you go to the Banco Popolare in Vicenza, which is farther inland and much, much, much drier, you see the pink stone that bank is famous for, and you realize that it's the same pink stone that's on the cathedral, except for in the cathedral, it's really old, and the structure of the stone is made out of balls. And remember in the Banco Popolare, the bronze castings have those round balls in them. So the details of it even go down to those balls, and the scale of the wall is big, and the details, they're still delicate because they're Scarpa, but the details are much bolder. And the way the metal is dealt with references the stone references the place, because it's the kind of stone that you get in Verona. No, is it Verona or Vicenza? I don't remember. Verona, it's in Verona.
It's in Verona, yeah.
Sorry. But so everything references the difference between the two cities. And I was amazed that precise of a material difference could reference the two cities. And then much later, I went to Sicily. And when you go to Sicily, there's all these different towns as you travel around the outer part of the island, and you go from a yellow town in a yellow mountain to a pink town in a pink mountain, to a beige town in a beige mountain, to a gray town in a gray mountain. I went, oh, it's always been here. He learned it from Italy. But those particulars and that fineness of observation is what I learned from Carlos Scarpa.
Wow, thank you. We have an anonymous comment. This person is shy. So they're saying, I just want to say that it is very inspirational work. All the design decisions evoke warmness and harmony with lighting, materials, and the idea behind every space. I am a fan of you now. Thank you. So that was that anonymous person. Peter Robb is also our faculty member in Lubbock, has a question. First starts by saying, beautiful work and clear understanding of materiality and detailing. I can definitely see connections to Kahn and the use of light to animate space. I noticed that you use the stair to activate transitional spaces and reach to the sky. How do you make a decision of what to focus your attention on with any project?
I don't, I just start. Start and I layer and I layer and I layer and I layer. And sometimes it's really hard to explain my projects because there's so many layers of decisions. Like anybody that's worked for me knows how kind of it's hellish because you have to redo things 1,000 times. I had one person label one of my sections, the section to end all sections. So I layer in an instinct after an instinct after an instinct. But the good thing is that I am a lot faster at those instincts used to take forever. Now I can actually make an instinct after an instinct after an instinct rather quickly. But I think my, like, and I think I'm actually being able to conceive of things much more whole than I was earlier. So like the time between the Mies Zeavin house, the last house that I showed, the time between the initial just curving of the form as a small sectional change to the final form was relatively fast. I think I wait until I know what the most important problem is. And I think that's the way I approach actually, that's a better answer. I try to figure out what's the most important problem with whatever site I have. So with the Spiral House, it was an easy problem. It's just like, it's a rock outcropping and I don't want to build on top of a rock outcropping because it's too much of a castle for me. That was a relatively easy problem to solve. With the last house, it was a much more complicated problem because it was this weird object, these weird trees, there was too much space, like there were lots and lots and lots, and then how do you create a sense of time inside of all of that? So that was more complicated. But sometimes it's as simple as in the interiors projects in New York, I have to keep these windows and they're black. What am I going to do with them? So I remember another project was that there's a giant space in the front that's like a loft, and then a developer did it so there's a 3 foot by 8 foot corridor that connects some bedrooms. Like, what the hell am I going to do with that? Because they don't belong together. And it's trapped in mechanical space. And so until I could figure out how to get rid of that corridor, I couldn't do anything. So it didn't matter what I was going to do. Nothing was going to work until I could figure out how to get rid of that small corridor. So I think that's maybe the best way I can say I work, is to identify the problem and then to figure out how to fix that and then to layer things in. I guess I was lucky, but because by the time I did the house, I was a developed enough architect that I could say this pond is a problem with this site. I didn't tell the clients that, obviously.
We have Dora Epstein-Jones, our chair of the architecture department in Lubbock. First, she says, Chris stole my question, so that already happened. But says, Kathryn, thank you for sharing your work and your thoughts. One of the striking qualities in your work and in the precedents that you cite, for example, Scarpa, is the way it frames the land. Can you please talk a bit about your attitude towards land and environment, the gathering of the view, the evocation of the climate, and perhaps the political ramifications of the moves that you make in terms of land and landscape?
Oh,
big question.
It's a really good question. And I love the question. I think one of the things that's important to know about me is that I grew up on a farm 15 miles from a town of 750 people. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere. So I have a strong association to the land. The land was also really flat. It was in North Dakota. It was the bottom of a glacial lake, and it was as flat as the top of my desk. So it was very difficult to have places in that landscape. And there were 3 places that I remember. One was a rock that was sitting on the landscape. One was a tiny little just dip in the landscape, which filled with water when it rained. And the third was a line of trees. And other than that, there were no places in that landscape. And so I think I became aware at a very young age of the difficulty of finding places in landscape and how important places in the landscape were. And so then when I started making work, the relationship to landscape and the horizontal surface, and also where the sky meets the ground, was always super important to me. And so I spent a lot of time in my practice thinking about the condition of the foundations and the condition of the horizon. So the condition of the foundations has a lot to do with an ecological perspective as well, surprisingly. But if you think about like a beachfront condition, it makes the most sense to put point foundations into a beach because it is the only way to not violate a sand condition in a really powerful way. Unlike the rock that I built on, the rock is, you can just anchor into it anywhere and start pouring walls. But so the kinds of foundations that you use and whether you use the lack of imagination for how you touch the ground in most architecture is really problematic, because what we do in most of the country everywhere is just either put in a poured foundation and pour a slab, which is only a condition for a certain number of landscapes. Like many of the southern climates make a lot more sense to get air going underneath the buildings. And there's just so many climates where it doesn't make sense to build that kind of foundation system. So the ecology of the natural landscape oftentimes tells you how best to build on it. And I guess at the same time, the microclimate of the site also tells you how best to build on it. So I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in a political way in any of these subjects, and I am realizing the importance of becoming more so. But I think my work has always dealt with those issues simply because I'm from a climate that ranges from 200 or from 100 degrees above zero to 100 degrees below zero. And so there's a 200-degree temperature swing. And if you don't deal with the climate, you're going to have a lot of problems. So I naturally knew how to do that just from my background. And because that was the easiest way to make spaces inhabitable. And then because I was so interested in the difference between the foundation conditions of a house, which is most of my work, and how to occupy the horizon, and mostly how not to make a house too big in its site, which is so horrible in most of the country, the way we have these giant objects that plop down on the landscape and are not scaled to the site at all. So I guess those are my thoughts.
Thank you. I think so. Dora also grew up on a farm, and Chris Taylor directs our land arts program. So I think the three of you could probably talk for hours about this, the absolute moment of touching the ground. And I think the way we're teaching our students is to really think of the site as a resistance, as something that has its own needs and systems and logics that need to give resistance to your project and push you back. And so I think
yeah, I totally agree with that. You work with the site. The site, right. The biggest compliment I had on the last house is that my client's friends are sculptors. And when the house started into construction, he said to them, "You're building a sculpture for the land." And it's like, yes, that was exactly what I was trying to do.
It's fantastic.
It's like you have to build with the site. But that it also means you have to look at sites in cities that way as well. So like the EMS site, that it used to be a sloping site the whole way, but then the tabula rasa for the hospital meant that they flattened the whole site, which made this huge slope before those tiny little houses, which was a disaster. And so you have to kind of think back toward what was this site originally and how can you recover that sense? Well, you can recover that sense by cutting the project into the ground so it's lower to the ground and trying to recover a sense of scale to it. It's like, I think how you understand cities and how you understand the construction of cities, you also have to understand the groundscape, because different kinds of groundscapes have created different scales of cities. Like St. Louis, which is built in the huge landscape. I didn't ever understand the Kimball Museum until I lived in St. Louis. And I finally understood that the Kimball Museum, which is so different than any other thing Kahn ever built, is scaled to the sky. It's so long and horizontal and has those split vaults. It's all about the scale of the sky in Texas. And I had never realized that. And in St. Louis, the scale of the city is scaled to the sky in the Midwest. So you have these massive blocks and that are scaled to this enormous sky. And so I think you have to think about urban conditions relative to the land, as well as landscape conditions relative to the land. So anyway.
It's great. We're way past the hour, and I think but people are still staying with us. So I think this is a good moment to maybe end with this idea of the scale of the Texas sky. I think many of us who have moved, Texas is much like New York, that people who live and practice here are not necessarily from here. And so many of us kind of look to the sky as a way to rescale ourselves. And so you'll see everyone's Instagram feeds. I see Dora's, I see all the other faculty who are online are always like posting photographs of this enormous daunting sky and the way it changes by the hour. So I think that's a good moment to maybe close out, although we have one comment from a student from El Paso. It's up to you if you'd like to hear it. I'd much sooner cut off faculty than students. So I'd like to read, to give Angel Arellano a voice. You talk about the passing of time in the Spiral House regarding light qualities that occur as a result of sun positioning throughout the day. I'm curious if the same idea of time was part of the decision-making in choosing exterior materials for the house. For instance, using the light white color of the exterior to help blend the house into the landscape during certain times of the year, such as during snowy seasons, as shown in one of the early images.
Actually, that's a fantastic question because it's extremely accurate. And it came down to a conversation between my two clients that were very intellectual. And we originally wanted the steel to be white, but the steel in their original house we did for them, you might have seen it, was painted with graphite paint, so it was dark. So we did an option for them that was dark steel because it was familiar, and we did another one that was white. And without interjecting too much, because they're both smart, we gave them the images and they had a conversation. And he said, well, I kind of like the dark steel. It looks like a couple of boys could have put it together on a river, just kind of thrown it together with the lean-to shapes. And she said to him, no, I like the white. It's like the sky reflected in the pond. And it goes much better. I was like, she's right. So you're exactly right too. That's exactly what we thought about.
That's
which
amazing.
is why the decking is white.
Wow. Great, Angel. You get A+ for tonight for noticing.
And the reflectiveness of the aluminum, which ripples as well on the exterior, and which is the reflectiveness of the pond. So excellent question.
Excellent.
Really more of an observation.
I think that's all the time we have. On behalf of the school and our dean, who just could not make it tonight, I thank you for being here. And I hope we get to see each other in physical space soon.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I love your students and your faculty, so it was really enjoyable.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Have a
Good night.